Get stuck straight into it. We're covering food and flare-ups. This is one of my favorite topics, and it's often because we get so many questions that relate back to this, and we thought, what a better way to address some of these questions in a webinar. And again, there's no shortage of myths and misconceptions when it comes to food and diet and what works for arthritis. Um, we'll get to that very shortly, but it's definitely an interesting topic that we could actually stretch over many, many webinars. So we'll do our best to crunch um, down to it tonight. We'll begin with an acknowledgement of traditional owners before we get started. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. I do want to make sure everyone is aware that this is really general information and advice. It's not intended to substitute any treatment or advice you've been given by your doctor. We always make sure the information we share with you is evidence-based. It's well supported, but if you do have questions that relate back to your own treatment, my first piece of advice will always be make sure you speak to your GP or your main healthcare provider. Otherwise, I'll do my best to help you out with any questions that pop up. So we've got a bit of myth busting to do tonight. So we will be looking at some facts and fiction, and I'll ask you some questions along the way. But we will be taking a deeper dive into the evidence, what actually exists. So hopefully by the end of this session, you feel a bit more confident about navigating food choices if you're wondering how they relate to your arthritis, your symptoms, and ongoing self-management. So I'm just letting some more people in. So it's really not uncommon for people to label certain foods as inflammatory. And, it's very easy for them to suggest what should be avoided for reducing flare-ups, improving symptoms, what works for better health. But the reality when it comes to nutrition in general, it's very complex. There are actually very few foods that can be definitively classified as inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. So this is really going back to where this scientific evidence is at. It's simply not strong or clear enough to support such oversimplified claims. So when it comes to arthritis, and I'm interested to know how many of you have actually gone into Google, you've typed in, what diet is best for arthritis, or does this food, flare up my arthritis symptoms? When I typed in arthritis and diet, you can see on my screen here, we got over 1 million results. That's a lot of information to kind of filter through. So you're probably well aware that there's a lot of information online. Just letting in some more people. And you'll come across really bold claims like you should be cutting out gluten. If you cut out gluten, your arthritis will disappear. Nightshades cause joint pain. This question comes up from time to time again in our seminars we host. And maybe it's about dairy. So these statements, whilst they sound really convincing, what we're here to do is help you understand that some of these claims aren't exactly backed by solid evidence. So that's what we want to sift through. There are actually very few one size fits all answers, especially when it comes to food. So that's why it's really crucial to kind of look for those trustworthy sources, understand the quality of evidence, understand how it stands up against those claims, and be really cautious with advice and promises about quick fixes. With over 1.6 million Google results that pop up, it's really important that we're questioning as consumers who's making these claims. Is there research to back it up? Is it a peer-reviewed source? Are the claims extreme or absolute? So it's really important to ask those questions. Okay. So nutrition, it does play a really important role in terms of why a person might develop disease, why it could continue to get worse. But on the other hand, it can play a really important role in making that disease either get better or just managing it more effectively. When we do consider how diet and weight impact disease, there are a few mechanisms that actually come into play. You have first the mechanical aspect, so overconsumption of mainly ultra processed foods, excessive added sugars, all these things can contribute to excess weight. But it's the excess weight that puts the additional strain on weight bearing joints like your hips and your knees. These can affect things like the structural integrity of joints and tissues. Sorry, just muting everyone. Second, you have the inflammatory component. So we're starting to learn more about how certain dietary factors can either promote or reduce inflammation. This in turn can influence the severity of symptoms and progression of disease. So flare-ups in conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory arthritis, these are very complex and they can be triggered by a lot of different factors. Um, Food can be one of those for some, and that's what I want to hone in on very shortly. So it's really important that to begin this, I want to take a look at flare ups and I want to make sure we're all across what they are. And I'm sure if you experience flare ups from time and time again, you're well across this. But flare ups are periods when arthritis symptoms suddenly worsen. So things like pain, swelling, stiffness, fatigue can intensify sometimes without warning. So these can last for hours, days, maybe weeks, and they do have a really big impact on things like your quality of life and what you can do from day to day. They're very unpredictable, as some of you might know, but there are two types of flares. So you have true flare ups, often driven by increased disease activity, particularly in conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, gout. It means the immune system is more active, so it does lead to that joint inflammation and can cause damage. These type of flares, they do require that medical intervention, and the flare-ups of symptoms you know, can really be debilitating. But then you can also have just a flare up of symptoms, and these can feel just as intense. So they're not to, this isn't to invalidate your experience of having a flare up, but it's to know that these type of flares aren't caused by an increase of disease activity. Instead, they are triggered by multiple things, and these are different for everyone. Stress, overuse of a joint, maybe fatigue, maybe dietary factors for some. And these symptom flares are more common in what we get in osteoarthritis and fibromyalgia and so on. So ultimately, where does diet come into this? Diet is more likely to influence a flare up of symptoms rather than true inflammatory disease flares. I think that's really important that we're across. Diet still absolutely plays a supportive role when you're having a true flare because it does influence that background inflammation. So there are absolutely some people who notice that eating certain foods, particularly those processed foods, maybe high in added sugars, high in trans fats, make their symptoms worse. And this could make things like joint pain, stiffness, fatigue more exacerbated. Conversely, choosing more anti-inflammatory foods might support better day-to-day symptom management. So in short, what we're saying here is that while food alone, it can't stop true disease flares, it can definitely play an important role here in helping manage symptoms and frequency of flare-ups and improve your overall quality of life. So I'm really interested to know and hear from you guys here. What's one food or diet tip that you've heard claims about? You're not quite sure if it worsens your arthritis. You're not sure where the evidence stands, but I'm interested to hear about the claims that have left you a bit puzzled. So take a minute to pop something in the chat box so we can circle back on those. Just letting some more people in. Yep, chat boxes filling up with some interesting You need to fast to get rid of the pain. That's not uncommon. Tomatoes, 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 nightshades, alcohol, definitely. Lots of nightshades. So probably a good start for this evening. We're going to start with the most popular arthritis villain, particularly in wellness blogs. These veggies do get a really bad rap in some corners of the internet. And for most people, they're actually quite full of nutrients that support overall health. So I'm actually interested if nightshades do cause you symptoms or if you experience any kind of side effects that might concur with you consuming nightshade veggies. So we will start with what nightshades actually are for those who aren't across this. But nightshades belong to the Solanese family, which are a group of plants, many of which are not edible. So tobacco is actually one example of a plant that belongs to this family. But there are also several other foods like tomatoes, potatoes, white potatoes specifically, eggplants, peppers. You can see them here, paprika. These are all foods that are part of this family and they form key parts of the diet worldwide. So they're an integral part of many cuisines. Um, the term nightshade has murky origins. It's possibly tied back to their historic use in medicinal contexts. Some plants in this family were thought to have narcotic or hallucinogenic effects, but we want to understand why the bad rep. So nightshades, they naturally contain a class of compounds. They're called glycoalkaloids, which are compounds that act as a defense mechanism for the plant. So these compounds can be really toxic in extremely high doses. Um, Solanine, for example, is found in green potato skins. So it can cause a lot of digestive upset. You don't want to eat a green potato skin. And it's why green potatoes can become quite toxic if they're not stored properly or, if they're consumed in extremely large amounts. So such cases are rare. I do want to highlight that. But a lot of plants, a lot of vegetables have protective compounds that can be harmful in large quantities. Um, and it can include those bitter tasting polyphenols, and they're found across foods like broccoli, spinach, maybe coffee, but in really small microdoses. But these compounds might actually enhance our body's own antioxidant defenses on the same end. So we do want to know what ways actually singled out when other foods actually contain similar types of natural chemicals that are designed to protect them against things like pathogens and bugs and all that stuff. And so one of the main promoters of the nightshade um, arthritis link was Dr. Norman Childers. And I'm not sure if any of you are across his work in this book here, but he was a horticulturist who had arthritis himself. He noticed within himself that consuming nightshades triggered his joint pain. And so there was a bit of a link there because he noticed the symptoms would often occur within that hour. He suspected he had a rare allergy, but then he realized later on that a lot of other people reported similar reactions. So that led him down the path to explore this a bit further, led him to promote nightshade avoidance for arthritis relief. So in 1977, he actually published books and pamphlets. He claimed that nightshades worsened arthritis, and he started using surveys to understand this from his readers. So in another edition, The Childers Diet to Stop Arthritis, that followed in 1981, 1985, 1986. So ultimately, this survey he created went out to about 5,000 new readers. It was about a 4-page questionnaire that drew 434 responses, and 94% of those readers, well, reported complete or substantial relief from symptoms. So, amongst his readers, he conducted these surveys with thousands of people responding. And 70 to 90% is a rough estimation of how many people reported substantial relief from the arthritis symptoms after eliminating nightshades completely. So his main hypothesis here was that the naturally occurring compounds that are found in these nightshade veggies, capsicums, tomatoes, eggplants, might interfere with how the body actually handles calcium. So he specifically speculated that these alkaloid compounds could disrupt that calcium metabolism, leading to deposits in tissues, including the joints, which is what is ultimately contributing to joint stiffness or pain. So, while he had really good intentions here to find solutions for managing arthritis symptoms, the surveys were self selected. They did lack rigorous controls. There were a lot of methodological limitations, which a lot of researchers, um, you know, are quite dumbfounded with the limitations here, with how many there are. Um, Emission of tobacco was one confounder. So his work was largely dismissed by mainstream biomedical researchers, and it's just due to the limited scientific rigor, the small sample sizes, and the publications going out in less prominent journals. So it didn't quite stand up to the quality of evidence that we need to say, hey, there's a cause and effect link here. Nonetheless, Childers was a respected horticulturist with decades of experience observing cause and effect in natural systems. So while his work isn't exactly backed by the methods that support a premise to make general recommendations to people living with arthritis, he did help establish the idea that nightshade sensitivity is very real for some people. So it's not exactly rare. And there are some people out there who might benefit from avoiding these vegetables. So, of course, his work has inspired that ongoing interest, and there's many anecdotal reports. Unfortunately, many of these lack the strong clinical evidence to support them. So, we can't exactly say that this is fiction, but we can't say it's a fact. Um, it's just that a lot more work is needed to be done in this area, and there's no exact reason to be eliminating nightshades from the diet when we don't have the evidence that exists just yet. Very recently, what's interesting to know is that the very first randomized controlled trial, which is specifically designed to test whether removing nightshades from the diet can have a measurable effect on inflammation and symptoms, particularly in people with RA. This was established last year. The study involves 40 participants with rheumatoid arthritis. It's intended to run over 8 weeks, and everyone in the study is getting general advice on following an anti inflammatory diet, but one group also follows a strict nightshade free diet. So, researchers are tracking both clinical symptoms, blood markers, they're looking at inflammation. And it's important to note that as of 2024, what's been published so far on this study is just a study protocol, meaning that it's been designed, it's been outlined. There's still a lot more work to be done on the design and the methods, but there aren't any results available just yet. So it is a very valuable step forward in this area because given that there's no other research, to stand up to the claims that's been made, I guess the nightshade arthritis connection it is based more on personal stories and older theories rather than strong scientific evidence at this stage. So, it's always good to stay posted in this space, but some people absolutely feel better avoiding them. But most people, for the minute, can enjoy nightshades as part of a balanced anti-inflammatory diet. These veggies contain abundance of health promoting nutrients and vitamins and active ingredients that are important for just general health and well-being. So we do want to now debunk whether sugar causes arthritis. This is one that pops up from time and time again as well. I'll just put some more people in. So, sugar, inflammation, and flare ups, we do know there is a link. Keeping in mind that we will focus more on the evidence that's behind added sugars. And the reason I make this really clear is that not all sugar is the enemy. We have a lot of naturally occurring sugars in fruits and vegetables and dairy. So these type of sugar containing products, they contain a lot of fiber, vitamins, other beneficial nutrients. When we're looking at the impacts of added sugars, they have very different effects on the body. So my aim here isn't to demonize sugar and tell you to remove it from your diet, but it's more information to just help you make more informed choices when it comes to food selection. So, what does the evidence say? Recent large scale studies have shown that added sugars are one of those clear risk factors for osteoarthritis, particularly in certain populations like females, people with low BMIs, those who have never smoked or consumed alcohol. So, high sugar intake is very strongly associated with chronic low grade inflammation, which is basically inflammation in the body that is persistent. So it can cause metabolic disturbances or stress in all your cells. Some of these which can contribute to joint degradation. So if we look at the study that's been done in this area, the US National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, it is a major ongoing research program that is designed to assess health and nutritional status of adults and children in the US. So it is run by the Centers for Disease Control, Prevention, and it combines interviews. So they look at things like diet, health history, lifestyle. They run physical examinations from time and time again, like lab tests and medical assessments. So it's a very widely used and reputable study in public health research. So it's used for building studies specifically on conditions like diabetes, obesity, arthritis, heart disease, nutrient deficiencies. And so the 2007 to 2018 cycles, they do include thousands of participants and often pulled for longer term analysis of trends. So in this particular context, when we're talking about arthritis, the data was used to examine whether added sugar intake was associated with, oh, there we go, was associated with higher likelihood of having osteoarthritis. And so the researchers analyzed the data from over 2,500 adults in the US. And what they found was really interesting. They found that people who ate the highest amounts of added sugar were much more likely to have osteoarthritis compared to those who ate the least, even after accounting for things like age, weight, activity. That link still held strong. So these are cross-sectional findings, meaning that casualty can't exactly be confirmed. But whilst this type of study doesn't prove that sugar causes osteoarthritis, it suggests a clear association. So it just grows to that body of evidence that supports the messaging behind reducing our sugar intake. And that could be one helpful way to actually support that joint health and longevity. So, over the years, there's been a lot of other surveys that have been done in clinical observations. They do indicate that people with rheumatoid arthritis report symptom flares after consuming sugary foods, and particularly sugar sweetened beverages. So, research suggests that sugar might play a role in increasing production of specific antibodies that are associated with flares and can contribute to the development of rheumatoid arthritis as well. Additionally, we know from a technical standpoint that high sugar intake can disrupt things like the gut microbiome, and that can potentially worsen inflammation systemically. So, if you look at the studies behind this, the Nurses' Health Study is one that stands up really well in terms of its quality. Similarly to the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, it's one of the largest, most influential long-term epidemiological studies, and it's designed to investigate risk factors for chronic diseases, particularly in women, and particularly those that are related more to lifestyle, diet, and just general health behaviors. So, from a large observational study of over 186,000 women from the Nurses' Health Study, they looked specifically at whether drinking sugar sweetened soft drinks was linked to a high risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis in women. What they found was really interesting. They found that women who regularly drank one or more sugary soft drinks per day had that higher risk of developing seropositive rheumatoid arthritis, which is a type of rheumatoid arthritis where specific autoantibodies are present in the blood. Interestingly, this link wasn't exactly observed with the diet or sugar free soft drinks, but it seemed to be the sugar that mattered most. So, this study again, it just adds to that growing evidence that added sugar, particularly in beverages, it could potentially play a role in increasing that inflammation and autoimmune risk. And if there is that family history there, there's a genetic susceptibility, all those things are important. And it's just one more reason to keep an eye on that intake. So, keeping in mind, again, I always have to go back to the limitations of these studies. It just because there is an association, it doesn't exactly prove causation. Other unmeasured factors that could influence results are at play here. So you can't exactly definitively say that there's a link there where uh, there is a cause and effect. But whilst there is a link, biological mechanisms still remain really unclear. It's a very grey space. How sugary drinks might trigger or accelerate autoimmune activity wasn't directly examined in this. There's a lot more work to do in that. Um, but the benefits of reducing soda intake has been well established, regardless of whether you have arthritis or not. So, not only cutting back on the soft drinks that are high in sugar, it can not only help with that autoimmune activity, but it might help reduce the risk of many other health conditions, can help prevent that weight gain, which contributes to the very common symptoms of arthritis like stiffness and pain, might support weight loss, which is very important when we're talking about treatments for osteoarthritis. And then you have the added benefits of improving metabolic health and so on. So there's really strong and consistent evidence from many large studies that show added sugars, especially fructose and sugar sweetened beverages, are linked to gout. So I'm not sure how many of us have gout here tonight, but when researchers looked across multiple studies, they absolutely found that drinking sugary sodas and similar drinks increases the risk of developing gout or having high uric acid levels by about 35%. So the evidence linking added sugars, especially fructose, and these sugar sweetened beverages to gout is very high quality because we're talking about the findings from multiple large scale prospective cohort studies and case control studies. So there is a strong body of evidence here. There's a strong, consistent association, which supports a likely causal relationship. And so this is why you will hear from time and time again by the rheumatologist or the GP to reduce that soft drink intake. So fructose in particular, it does play a big role because it causes the body to produce that uric acid, which can form crystals in the joint, which triggers very painful gout attacks. So for those who do consume in studies, those who have consumed the highest amounts of fructose have had a significantly larger risk of getting gout compared to those who consume the least. So just to summarize our information here, sugar, it doesn't directly cause arthritis, but it doesn't mean it doesn't play a role. So sugar has several knock-on effects in the body that we can establish and we can go on about, but we know that consuming too much, just like anything, is very pro-inflammatory. Its effects in the body over time can make things worse. But rather than thinking of sugar as the cause, it's more accurate to see it as maybe a contributor, something that can fuel the inflammation and create those metabolic problems that worsen symptoms or raise the risk in the long run. We know that cutting back on the added sugars can be overall really beneficial for good health, support healthy weight, it can lower inflammation, help with the management of conditions like gout. Um, and so some people, they do notice that the extra sugar consumption can trigger those flares. It can make them feel worse overall. Some won't realize until they've given it a solid crack at reducing it. So if you don't know where to begin and you've been considering on cutting back on the sugar, reducing it, start by knowing where it hides. So sugar isn't just in those sweets, the lollies and the chips. It can also be found in those flavored yogurts, the breakfast cereals, sauces, snack bars, packaged health foods as well. So it's a really good idea to just begin by reading those labels. Look out for anything ending in ose, so glucose, fructose, sucrose. All these are different types of sugar. And try replacing those soft drinks with water, soda water, herbal teas, plain iced tea. Just one can of soft drink can have up to 8 to 10 teaspoons of sugar. So, um, where I'm going to finish this particular slide off is I don't, well, in terms of yourself, don't aim for perfect. Just aim for better. So, cutting sugar is not about never having sugar ever again. It's just about less often and less overall. So think progress, not perfection. So this is another really interesting, I wouldn't say it's a myth, but it is a common question that comes through a lot. Should I cut gluten from my diet? Will cutting gluten help my symptoms? And I must say, for some, absolutely. For others, it won't have any effect at all. So the reality is the connection between gluten and arthritis, it's not well understood here, especially when there is an autoimmune component involved. So what we know is that there's no evidence that exists to suggest gluten causes arthritis or does it cause arthritic symptoms. So while gluten, and for those who don't know what gluten actually is, it's a protein that's found in wheat, barley, rye. It's often blamed for joint pain. It's one of those villains in the arthritis wellness blogs. Um, it only clearly impacts joint health in people who either have celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition where gluten triggers a full body immune response, including joint inflammation, and those who have non celiac gluten sensitivity. So, a condition where people might still get symptoms like fatigue, bloating, maybe joint pain when they eat gluten, but there isn't going to be the inflammatory damage that's done to the gut that we do see in celiac disease. So, people who are celiac can have symptoms anywhere in the body when exposed to gluten. And partially digested fragments do leak from the intestine into the bloodstream. So, even just the tiniest exposure of gluten is enough to set off a cascade of inflammatory symptoms in the body. So, in some people, the immune system sees gluten as the enemy, and it can definitely cause inflammation in the intestines. Sometimes it can affect other organs and tissues if it's not well managed. So, it can lead to other serious problems outside of the gut: osteoporosis, anemia, fibromyalgia, joint pain, and more. For those without celiac or non celiac gluten sensitivity, a gluten free diet isn't proven necessary for most people with arthritis. Some people might report feeling better on a gluten free diet. This could potentially be due to just reducing the processing in the diet, reducing that general processed food intake as opposed to gluten itself. But the bottom line here is that gluten isn't a universal trigger for arthritis. So a gluten-free diet isn't a proven treatment. Okay, if we go to our research, there is one study that we were able to locate if we're talking about the efficacy of removing gluten from the diet of people with RA. You'll probably be able to see some of the limitations here right in front of us. So keep in mind, this was a very small case series. So there were only 4 people involved in this study who had long-standing rheumatoid arthritis. So these participants, keep in mind they're already taking usual rheumatoid arthritis medication, but researchers asked them to also try a gluten-free diet. And this was just to see if it could help reduce inflammatory markers or improve symptoms. So what happened? All 4 people stayed on their medication. It wasn't a diet-only approach, but after starting the gluten-free diet, some people did report less joint pain, less swelling, better function, better energy, fewer flare-ups. So it does sound promising, but this is important. We have to really look at this more with a critical lens, and that's what we're always going to do here when we're busting myths. There were only 4 people involved, so the study was way too small to draw firm conclusions here. There wasn't a control group, so we don't know if the changes were from the diet exactly or whether they came about from medication, placebo, or just chance. The outcomes were subjective as well, so it was based on what the patients reported. It wasn't measured with any biomarkers, so there were no inflammatory blood markers that were tracked in this. So just like any piece of research, this study is interesting, but it's just a starting point. Some people with rheumatoid arthritis might feel better on a gluten-free diet, but we can't say for sure that it's effective or necessary for now. So only people with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity are advised to avoid that gluten for health reasons. If you're considering cutting it, removing it, you can always bring it up with your GP or a dietitian if you haven't seen one. And so, circling back to the question, should people with rheumatoid arthritis cut out gluten? Short answer is no. Um, Anyone with arthritis, the short answer is no. So, current scientific evidence, it doesn't support a broad recommendation to go gluten free. There was a 2022 literature review that looked at this in more detail. There was no solid evidence that was actually pulled out to support gluten exclusion. For most people with rheumatoid arthritis, the link between gluten and arthritic symptoms is pretty weak. So, cutting out gluten isn't backed by that strong research. So, everyone, of course, reacts differently and responds differently to food and how it makes you feel. If you personally feel that gluten could be affecting your symptoms, it's absolutely okay to explore that. You could always test a supervised trial of a gluten-free diet. You might want to do that under the guidance of a dietitian or nutritionist. But just know it's not something that's recommended on that bigger level for everyone with RA. And it's also important to not just jump the gun and exclude entire food groups from your diet, just because sometimes it can lead to nutritional gaps that could make things worse off in the long term. Like cutting things like fiber, B vitamins, iron aren't exactly going to be beneficial in the long run. So the key message here is that gluten isn't a one size fits all approach for everyone. So I do like to go to my favorite topic. We're going to give a special mention here to one of the most unfairly blamed so-called inflammatory foods out there, dairy. My poor old dairy. We get questions all the time that come through. Is dairy really an inflammatory food? Should we be keeping it on the avoid list? And we're going to delve more into that. Let's jump straight into the evidence because where the truth lies about dairy and inflammation story is opposite of what several blogs, Google articles proclaim. And this was the topic of a systematic review of the clinical evidence from 52 trials that looked specifically at dairy consumption and inflammation. So they used a novel inflammatory score to quantify whether dairy had any kind of anti or pro-inflammatory effects. And the results found overall, dairy showed mild anti-inflammatory effects in most people. So it's good for us who love cheese and milk and love dairy as part of our normal diet. The benefit was strongest for those with metabolic conditions. So obesity, and insulin resistance. Of course, you have individuals who again have allergies or sensitivities to cow's milk proteins, who had pro-inflammatory responses. But these could be expected for those who do not respond to dairy well. Considering how many bioactive properties are actually found in dairy, especially those of fermented sources with good strains of probiotics, it makes sense as to why they would have a more anti-inflammatory role. And it's important to note the study that was done there wasn't actually funded by the dairy industry. It was very non-biased. So in 2023, there was another analysis done that looked at the data from that large national US health survey. It included thousands of adults and it looked at investigating whether the relationship between milk intake and rheumatoid arthritis, if it existed and if it caused any symptoms. They looked at how often people consumed milk or milk products, whether people reported having been diagnosed with RA. What they found was that people who drank milk once a day were more likely, um, less able to report having rheumatoid arthritis. So in fact, they had about a 32% lower chance of having rheumatoid arthritis to people who consumed no milk or very little amounts of milk. So what's even more interesting is that there was a clear trend, and the more regularly people consume dairy, the lower the rate of RA in this group. So before we just go running towards our fridge and you know, pouring glasses of milk at any opportunity we get, we always want to keep this in context. So again, this was a cross-sectional study, meaning that it shows a link, not cause and effect. So we can't say dairy prevents RA, and the RA diagnosis in this study, it was self-reported. So that brings its own limitations in its own rights. So it's also possible that some people with rheumatoid arthritis might already be avoiding dairy, maybe because they think it makes them feel worse. But overall, this study just supports what we've seen in other research, that dairy, especially those fermented sources with probiotics like yogurts, cheese, might have a neutral or an anti-inflammatory effect. So dairy doesn't cause arthritis. The type of dairy does matter. So low fat and fermented dairy are going to offer extra benefits. And of course, there are exceptions. There are some people who are sensitive or have allergies to dairy. So if you're not sure if you do have a sensitivity or allergy, there are definitely ways to explore that. And I'll give you some advice about that shortly. Now, lastly, dairy can actually support not just joint health, but bone health as well. So dairy in itself is a king source of calcium, protein, vitamin D, all of these which are active ingredients essential for maintaining strong bones and supporting muscle function. So when you have an arthritic condition, of course, we often focus on the joints, we focus on those tissues, protection, but the bones play a major role here too. So it's really important that we're looking at keeping them strong. We're looking at reducing our risk of osteoporosis and osteopenia where we can. So we're looking at the inclusion of things like weight-bearing exercise, getting enough calcium and vitamin D, managing inflammation, and then of course those behaviors like avoiding smoking and excessive alcohol consumption. So the takeaway here is dairy can absolutely be a part of an anti-inflammatory joint-friendly diet as long as it works for you. So essentially, there's no shortage of those myths and misconceptions. We've heard you just need to drink celery juice or fasting. Extreme detox diets can reverse arthritis. Everyone with arthritis should avoid dairy, gluten, nightshades. So there's all these misconceptions out there. And while we can't bust every myth in one go, there are some things I want you to take away so you can be able to filter through all the noise on the internet. So when you hear a claim about arthritis, especially the one that seems really oversimplified or really promising, ask yourself what the source is. Is it backed by scientific evidence, or is it um, someone's personal story? Is it an influencer post? Has it been studied in a large group of people? Is it something that sounds too good to be true? Because often they are. It's really important that when we're scrolling through articles that promise cures and fixes, we remain curious, stay evidence informed, and we do always go back and get that advice from our health professionals, your GP, dietitians, nutritionists, and you're the one who knows your body best. So if something feels right for your body, that absolutely matters. But maybe you should check in with your GP or rheumatologist or a trusted health practitioner before jumping the gun, making really big changes to our diets. So we can confidently say food is not a cure, but it is a powerful tool, and there are actually very many helpful dietary approaches that do have evidence. We've done a few webinars on these before in the past if you ever want to take a deeper dive into those. But we do have evidence behind the Mediterranean diet, increasing omega-3s in the diet, increasing fiber, whole grains, healthy proteins, things we can do every day that promote good health and healthy joints. But when it comes to building a joint healthy, friendly plate, it's even the small, consistent changes that can make meaningful improvements. So you can picture your plate like this model on the right here. So it's really colorful, balanced, and nourishing. But on the left, you can see how that same idea can come to life in real meals. So think of things you can make at home: teriyaki chicken, stir fry, quinoa salad. I've got falafel wraps for dinner tonight, bowl of porridge for breakfast. There are so many simple everyday meals, as long as they're filled with protein, fiber, colors, plants. These can tick the boxes for joint friendly nutrition. If you're ever curious about whether certain foods affect your symptoms, whether there are safe and structured ways to actually explore this further without putting your nutrition at risk. So it's not about fear or restriction here, it's just about that curiosity, learning what works best for your body. This is always best done under the guidance of a dietitian, but if you suspect a food is giving you grief, it's a really good idea to actually log that. And that's a really good starting point. So, keeping a symptom and food tracker, you could use a simple scale to measure symptoms, 1 to 10, how painful your joints are. It's important to be disciplined, consistent if you're ever keeping a symptom and food tracker. After a couple of weeks, you can ask yourself if your symptoms have noticeably improved. Do they feel the same? Um, if you've got a diary there, you can take it to a dietitian. You would know yourself and your body if you feel better. But having a log can be really helpful tool to just help you understand, what you've done and what's made you feel better, or maybe it hasn't made any difference at all. So, just to summarize tonight's session, we've established there's no one size fits all dietary approach. Added sugars don't cause arthritis, but growing evidence suggests high intakes could worsen inflammation. Maybe it contributes to the risk of developing or progressing arthritis symptoms and disease progression. Unless you have celiac disease or a clear gluten sensitivity, there's no strong evidence that gluten actually triggers the arthritis or flare ups. There's also no scientific evidence that nightshades worsen arthritis. And then, despite what you might read online, dairy doesn't cause inflammation for most people. There are certain types that can actually be beneficial and have an anti inflammatory effect. So, lots of information to take away there, lots of evidence to kind of think about. Um, you can find out more information through our Clara app if you haven't come across it just yet. But it's designed more specifically for people with rheumatoid arthritis. But in saying that, it's for everyone. There's a lot of information on there, and it's an easy way to kind of sift through some of that. And it does, it's backed by a trusted source like the arthritis movement. So what we are almost at time, but we've got about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause the recording here.